Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along this morning to the Electoral Reform Society's latest Democracy Agenda series. My name is Darren Hughes. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society, and I'm joined today by other colleagues from the ERS who have welcomed you into the room. Can I thank you all for coming along, particularly some familiar faces who have been to all of our events, but also some new people who have come along today to listen to Natalie Bennett, the leader of the Green Party in England and Wales. If you could make sure you've signed in, not because we want to account for everybody, but just because if you're interested in these sort of issues and want to make your voices heard, we need to build a big coalition of people who are concerned about the way democracy is going. So we don't want this to be a one-off contact with you. There are other colleagues here today who are members of the board of the Electoral Reform Society and can explain to you the benefits of membership or being a supporter. So please, if you'd like to talk to any of us afterwards, we would be delighted. Because we've never given up on the idea of democratic and constitutional change for Britain. We're the oldest democracy organisation at 131 years this year going, trying to improve the lot of voters. And I think as this Parliament's gone on, we've seen more and more these issues aren't going anywhere. We now have six-party politics trying to survive on a two-party system. This is impossible to make work, and it leaves a lot of people voiceless in the process. So we're having these democracy agenda forums to give all the political parties a chance to share with us their values, their vision and their views about how democracy can be reinvigorated. And it's an absolute delight to have Natalie Bennett with us here today from the Green Party, who are, I think it would be an understatement to say, something on a bit of a roll at the moment. And so the timing, although we set this many months ago, we weren't to know that in this week we would be seeing record high Green Party membership, not just in England and Wales, but in Scotland as well. And of course the opinion polling is just reinforcing that the party loyalties of the two big old parties is crumbling away. One of the polls this morning has Labour and the Tories barely able to muster a little over 55% of the vote each. So,
how does this work?
Sorry? Oh, the tea and coffee machine. I was about to explain the evils of first past the post. I think it's stretching it to blame it for the tea and coffee machine. So we better stay on topic. Look, if you'd like to share the views you hear today, we're on Twitter like everyone else is. We're using the hashtag Democracy Agenda for that. So if you hear things that Natalie says you want to share with the world, please do that. Natalie will talk to us for a while.
About half an hour.
About 30 minutes or so, and then is happy to stop there and take questions, and we'll run the session from that point. So thanks again for coming, and now having got the refreshments organised, please give a very warm welcome to Natalie Bennett, the leader of the Green Party.
Well, thank you very much. And the top of my piece of paper says how to build a better democracy, but perhaps we should be making how to make a better cup of tea, and possibly not involving plastics one-use sachets that get thrown in the bin. I might have to say, as constitutionally as Green Party leader, but nonetheless, I am having a cup of tea because sometimes you need a cup of tea. But to get serious, welcome and thank you for coming along. And the fact that we're in a standing room only situation, and apologies to those who are like that, really does show how much there is really interest in this issue. Excitement is building. And I'm delighted to be giving my third speech under the auspices of the Electoral Reform Society and its allies. And this really is the most exciting time to be giving a speech about this. And I'm not just saying that because of the green surge. Yes, that is the hashtag. Although perhaps you'll excuse me for dwelling on it for a second, because we've seen, frankly, astonishing progress in the Green Party of England and Wales. Membership since the 1st of January is up 50%. 50%. That is the 1st of January 2015. Over the whole of the last year, it was up about 120%. And in the past 3 days, as Darren's referred to, we've seen three polls putting us respectively on 9, 10 and 11%. But don't worry, I'm not going to make this a partisan speech. What I do want to do is use that to stress how much there's a hunger out there on the streets, on the doorsteps, in the cafes, in the pubs, a real hunger for change. An enthusiasm for big ideas when people are offered those big ideas. And of course I should, to be fair, mention that the SNP has also seen massive growth since the Scottish referendum. And I think it may be that future historians will mark that point as the start of Britain's peaceful revolution, constitutional revolution. So I've been asked today to set out the Green Party's stall for political and democratic reform. And if I were to look for a summary, a phrase of what we need, that peaceful revolution is what we so desperately need. We need a democratic revolution, a political revolution. We need to do democracy and politics very differently to what we've been doing in the past few decades and indeed over the past century. Because if we look specifically at the Westminster Parliament, the last big change really was women getting the vote. That was almost a century ago. We're coming up to the centenary of it. And now I didn't actually know until Darren said it that the ERS has been around for 131 years. But I don't think we should hold it against them that they haven't quite managed that change since then, because it's been pretty tough times for that kind of change. And what we've seen is really stasis in Westminster. And we've got to the point where without a continuing cycle of refreshment and renewal of change, it really is just too late to tinker. It's too late to change a setting on a knob here, change a handle a little bit there. We need real, massive change. Now, I do understand the concern of some, and I've been talking to some of them in recent weeks, that the risk is that if you go for big, really major change, that means no change at all. There is a risk that some people say that that means, oh, setting that up is just like kicking it into the long grass. You know, it disappears off into the distance, people go off to report and nothing ever happens. And if we look at the Chilcot example, we're possibly seeing today an example of that. But we've got to take on the fundamentally undemocratic nature of an unelected second chamber, really, in the 21st century. Yeah. The first past the post electoral system in the lower house that, as Darren referred to, just is utterly ill-fitted to the age of six-party politics. And I think we're going to see an enormous boost to the argument against first past the post in the coming election, because I think there could be quite a lot of MPs elected on not much more than 25% of the vote. And that's just going to look really stupid, realistically. And a more fundamental, if less clear-cut situation, it's becoming very clear that the situation where power and money is held at the centre and it's allowed to trickle down or not to the regions, to the councils, to local people, local communities, that is failing. The money, the power isn't going there, it's all being centralised, and that's a huge problem in our democracy. And I think if we're thinking about the question of incremental reform versus big change, we can draw some lessons, and I do apologise to people in this room for bringing up bad memories, but we can draw some lessons from the AV referendum of 2011. And I'm sure there was a lot of people in this room who were, as I was, standing on doorsteps and working the phones, sort of saying to sceptical-looking people, yeah, well, AV isn't very good, but it's a bit better than what we've got now, so you should vote yes. It's really not surprising we didn't win. And actually now, in hindsight, it's a really good thing that we didn't win. Because if we had, what we'd be getting now is, well, you've had your reform. That's done and dusted. Why are you talking about more change? We've already done that. So the stasis, in a way, the clear fact that the whole system hasn't changed is actually really quite useful. And I think, thinking about that, that was an incremental reform, and it failed. It utterly failed to excite or even interest the British public. And so one of the things I want to focus on today is how we might get an inspired discussion, inflame public interest, get people talking about it in the way that people were talking about the referendum in Scotland. Now, I was actually up in Scotland about 10 days or so before the referendum, perhaps 2 weeks. And I went door knocking in a very poor area of Edinburgh, Leith. And I was absolutely astonished because in 2 hours of talking to quite a lot of people, I found one non-voter. Everybody else I spoke to had formed a view. Really, not just was saying they were voting this way or that way, but they'd say, yeah, I'm voting this because I saw that on the telly and I thought about that and I did that. And you mightn't have always agreed or thought their logic entirely hung together, but they'd really thought about it, they'd really engaged. And so I think, and I didn't actually see this myself, but we all heard, I'm sure read lots of reports of it, we've got a test when we start to think about what we need if we're going to propose electoral reform. How do we get the public involved? A test to ask, can you imagine strangers at a bus stop, British strangers at a bus stop, starting a conversation about the political issue of the day? And that's my test, really, that I think we need to think about other political issues as well, but electoral reform. Is this going to be exciting enough, involving enough, maybe even angering enough, to get people talking to each other as perfect strangers? Now, I can imagine some big changes, the kind of changes that the Green Party's policies for a sustainable society call for. A fully elected upper house with proportional representation in the lower house, job share MPs that would open up the role to lots more different people, and other measures to make the Parliament far more representative of the country. And I think you might start to get excitement, not even perhaps about one of those, but about a package of those. If you think about the strangers at the bus stop test, role play it for a second. We have a woman of pension age in a sensible cardigan beside a young man in dreadlocks wearing a Democracy PR in the Commons badge. And she says to him, "But young man, when you want to go to your local MP to complain about the library's hours being cut, how will you know who to go to if it's proportional representation?" Nah, I don't think I can quite see that one on its own either. But there's one conversation starter that I can imagine, and this I think is the idea that we need to build around. And that's the idea of a People's Constitutional Convention. Handing the power to the people and saying, we're going to semi-randomly draw a group of people so they're representative of the country, give them the resources, the experts, the time they need, give them a blank slate and say, right, you are the people, start with a blank piece of paper and see how should we be governed. So if we go back to that role play for a second. Young man, you're wearing that badge. Do you know somebody who's on the commission? Young man, one of my classmates got selected and he's there. And I tweet him regularly about it. Okay, it's all role play and it's just a thought. But I think that's my real challenge, that the main theme of what I want to talk about today is, you might or might not agree with me with the nature of what I'm suggesting, the People's Constitutional Convention. But I'd urge you to think about what would get excitement at that conversation at the bus stop. It's a real struggle with electoral reform. I was going on Newsnight this week and thinking about how to get it in and how to, in 30 seconds, something exciting. And that's the challenge. And, you can't do it in 30 seconds. It has to be a long-term conversation. But something that people would go, oh, I, myself, the bank clerk in Wigan, could be in that. And that's the kind of thing that I think could get people excited. And the other thing that I think, as well as the conversation starter, the bus stop conversation, is we really have to offer people hope. And that's one of the problems that we're really struggling with at the moment in British politics. The need for hope, fear about the future, really does sum up the kind of general emotional state of the nation. And a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling that you get the same kind of politics no matter what you vote for. The three business as usual parties are up there. There's a lot of concern about corruption, about boys' clubs, which you might have noticed I was making a reference to this week, about misgovernment. And one book that I really urge, and I keep preaching about this, but Steinringen's Nation of Devils, about, and you mightn't find people saying this to you on the doorstep, but they get it at an instinctual kind of level, the quality of governance, the quality of our decision making. The fact that I was at the National Insulation Association conference, and there's sort of, people are saying with tones of resignation, well, we think government policy is probably going to destroy our industry again somewhere around about early 2016. And people don't really feel like they can do anything about it. They know there's some good people in Parliament, in government, who are trying to stop that, but they just don't feel like anything's going to really be made, sensible decisions are not going to be made. And we've got to offer hope to people who, when you look at the polls, when you ask them, do you think your children and grandchildren will have a better life than you have had? Increasingly people say no. And that's something we have got to turn around. Now, I am going to get sort of political for a second, in the sense that the nature of political change, and I think this feeds into the nature of constitutional change as well, is that we've had 3-4 decades where just neoliberal Thatcherite ideas, greed is good, the planet is infinite, we can just keep plundering it, have just utterly dominated. And we need to get into our national discourse, into our national discussion, different kind of ideas, the kind of ideas that I set out that say that we should set 2 criteria. We should ensure that everybody in our society, to start off with, get to the world later, in our society everybody has access to the resources for a decent quality of life, without fear, without worry, just knowing they'll be able to put food on the table and keep a roof over their head. And we have to all collectively do that within the limits of our one planet. And that, I think, is the model of the new kind of politics that we've got to have. But we have to think about whether we can really do that, make that happen, make that believable within the institutions that are basically early 20th century institutions that were created in a very different time, in very different circumstances, in very different kinds of technology. And, of course, that are decorated and obfuscated by all those wonderful things like tights and swords and archaic language and chaotic working practices, none of which really help us or make that institution over there accessible, understandable, believable in the 21st century. And I think one of the other things that we need to do as campaigners, and there's a real parallel here with small g green campaigners over the years. We've often been accused of stereotyped, sometimes with some fairness, of being somewhat hectoring, of standing there saying, you've all got to change your ways or the polar bears are going to get it. And, I've sat in rooms much like this, and I understand why, but I've heard campaigners basically haranguing often young women going, the suffragettes fought to get the vote for you, why aren't you using it? And one of the things that I'm quite often asked is, should we make voting compulsory? And I don't believe we should, because I think that what we need to do is, it's the responsibility for politicians to make voting exciting enough that pretty well everybody wants to do it.
Yeah.
Don't put the weight of responsibility on the voters and force them reluctantly to do something they don't want to do. It just doesn't work. So we've got to think about where the responsibility lies. And there's hope and chance for the voters to change things, but we have a responsibility to give them the chance and the hope, the feeling that they can do that. What we've got to do is try and change the terms of the debate, and this is the political change rather than the constitutional change. And it's something that I try to do, and indeed I was on the Jeremy Vine show having about my 7th debate that day about the debates. And yes, I have developed a bit of a slogan, which is, let's debate something other than the debates. And I kind of rammed into the space, and I was lucky I was down the line, which makes it harder for the presenter to cut you off. And I kind of went, I don't want to debate about the debates, I want to debate about making the minimum wage a living wage, renationalising the railways, keeping the NHS publicly owned and publicly run, and zero tuition fees. and Jeremy Vine kind of grumpily said, because he hadn't been able to cut me off, well, we don't want to talk about manifestos now. And it's like, I'd much rather talk about the manifesto than I would debate about the structure of the debates. And I think the public is much more interested in thinking about, as we well know from the surveys, how the NHS is run than they are about the fine details of how the debates are structured. And there's a real responsibility to our institutions to make sure that political debate, political discussion, and I'd include the BBC and other broadcasters in this institutional structure, to actually improve the quality of debate, to get the issues debated, not to, as is often said, treat politics like a football game. Who scored in P&Qs today? Who delivered their prepared jokes in the best possible second-rate comedian kind of manner? There's a lot of change that we really need, that we need to do to inspire people. Now, I've talked in fairly general terms, so I'm just going to very briefly throw a few thoughts into the mix here. And one of the things that perhaps I suspect none of the other speakers will have brought up in this series, and that I do want to bring up, is the whole issue of direct democracy. And I often encounter, indeed, I was standing on a wet edge of Parliament Square with Occupy Democracy probably about a month ago, being fairly well harangued myself by someone who said representative democracy can never be reasonable, it has to be direct, people have to vote on every single decision themselves. And indeed on the weekend I was in the 5 Live studio with Pinar's Politics with Twiggy Garcia, who's he's most famous for attempting citizens' arrests on Tony Blair. But he's now working on calls for direct democracy, the idea that people could, through technology, vote on every conceivable issue. And I don't believe that's a viable model, certainly not in the society that we've got today. We think about Britain as being the longest working hours culture in Europe. We think about childcare and elder care and all those kind of things. But I think we do need to think about that and how we can get people more directly involved at some kind of level. And that means things like locally participatory budgeting, locally, getting people the chance to have power at a local level so they can use power at a local level. Because I think that's where direct democracy is most reasonable and most viable, local decision making close to people's homes. And that means, and one of the things that thinking about direct democracy and thinking about the whole issue of political education, and that's something that I think we should all be thinking about a lot, and how we need to get much more education about politics into schools. But it really struck me when I was having a discussion with some education professionals, and I was talking about how sixth formers say to me, we just don't really understand anything about this. There's that thing in Brussels and that thing in Westminster and something kind of local, and we don't know what any of that means. And we can educate people. They might or might not be listening. It's probably not the most exciting topic in the world. How does the European Union work? But if we're really going to get people with the idea of democracy, and we think about direct democracy, I think we need to think about starting in schools. And I think we need to make schools more democratic institutions in and of themselves. And, I'm a school governor, and it's a bit scary, but I think we should think about allowing, encouraging, supporting much more direct democracy in schools. The school council can make more substantive decisions than what colour the school badge is. And if people start from a pretty young age doing democracy at school, then doing democracy is just going to be the natural thing that you do. That's part of your life, making decisions that affect your lives. So, thinking about direct democracy, not necessarily, I'm not a proponent of the whole hog. I kind of imagine myself, coming home from a day at work, sitting down and reading up on regulations for the control of breweries or something. Well, breweries might be quite fun, but I can't really imagine people doing that as a regular kind of thing. We do need to specialise, we do need representatives, I believe, but we need to think about how we can have a blend of direct and participatory democracy. The other key point that I wanted to raise is the whole issue of localism, and I made some reference to this before, but I think this has to be key in what we're thinking about. Power has to start locally and only be referred up when necessary. I'm just going to read, and I won't do this too often, but this is the Policies for a Sustainable Society, which is the Green Party's. We have very direct democracy. All of our policy is decided by our members, which one of the other sides of direct democracy does mean the Policies for a Sustainable Society, if you print them out, does come out about that thick. But I'm going to read you a couple of sentences of it. We live in a state where over centuries of struggle, some democratic rights and institutions have gradually been grafted onto a feudal monarchy. In that feudal monarchy, all power flowed downwards from the monarch, and the people were subjects and not citizens. We believe that the basic principle of government should be the reverse of this. That is, that power flows upwards from the people, and from their most local levels of government to the higher levels. And I think we've never really had that principle in Britain, as that passage indicates. And I think we've really got to think about how we can do that. And there's some really interesting examples. You might know Frome in Somerset, where their whole group of independents took over, astonishingly, broke all the political rules, took over the local council after something like a 5-month campaign. They hadn't existed 5 months before the election. There's a little book, mercifully brief book called Flat Pack Democracy, if you want to have a look at it. And that's a kind of example of localism rising up from utterly the grassroots, from a small market town. And the third principle that I want to stress, and as an old feminist, this one's particularly close to my heart, is we desperately need genuine representativeness in terms of a parliament, elected representatives that look like the country. And gender is the obvious and most kind of easiest one to tackle on this. I don't think I have to tell anyone in this room 23% female MPs. And unless voters give us that kind of peaceful revolution that I was talking about, if politics stays much the same as it is, that's not going to significantly change. So one of the other things when we're thinking about these new structures, thinking about people getting excited, we need a parliament that contains the dinner lady from Ceredigion, the bus driver from Liverpool, all kinds of different people, all kinds of people from different backgrounds. You know, the perhaps two disabled people in a job share, you know, they're really able to say, and I always have to give my example of this because this is from my local area, but we have near the Royal Free Hospital, there's an overland train station, and they say that they're really sorry but they can't provide proper disabled access because goods trains go through there too, and so you can't put a ramp in. And I really think that if we had more disabled people in Parliament, in our local council, someone would work out how you could deal with the goods trains and the ramp. If someone really had the will, the desire. And that, I think, you know, is an on-the-ground example of the kind of thing that just falls through the cracks at the moment. That's a few thoughts, really, about the agenda that we need to be taking into this election. And I think there's something else that's well worth thinking about, and a sense of history and a sense of where we're coming from. And that's the fact that, of course, we're celebrating the anniversary of the Magna Carta this year. Radio 4 sometimes seems to be doing little else, I get the impression. And I'm certainly not going to claim to be an expert on the constitutional history of the 13th century. But I think it's clear that if you look at the impact of that over the centuries, that was genuinely an instrument of real change. It was an instrument that was powerful. It was an action that probably had impacts far beyond what any of its drafters, what any of its signatories were thinking about in the political extinguishes of the moment. But it's another way of thinking about inspiration, about excitement, about engagement. If you go and visit the Magna Carta in the British Library, and around it there's always a small, polite scrum of people. It's not quite the same as the Mona Lisa. You probably haven't got the sex appeal bit to add into the. It's not quite so visual, but you get people from Japan and China, people from Australia and the US, all kind of people. And in fact, I used to be a volunteer in the British Museum, and I used to sit in the old British Library part of the British Museum, and you had people with old guidebooks who'd go into the British Museum and say, "I want to see the Magna Carta," because it was there about 3 decades ago. And you'd have to say, sorry, draw a little map of how they got to the British Library. and they'd set off holding that little map with the intention of, because they wanted to see the Magna Carta. And that's something important and exciting. And that's, I think, what we need. We need to deliver excitement, hope, deal with the anger, the dissatisfaction and the frustration. And that's really my final message. What I'd urge you to do is, it's very easy when you're thinking about electoral reform to get bogged down in a lot of detail and a lot of, AMS versus pure PR, open lists versus closed lists, and all of those debates have to be had. But communicating with the public, thinking about what we're offering, we've got to offer something big, something hopeful, something that is real change. Because to bring the public on board for a political and democratic revolution, we need that excitement and enthusiasm. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. You said you'd speak for 30 minutes and you spoke for 28, so a very sustainable approach to the time allocation, and we're grateful for that. So now we're going to take some time for questions, and I might just use the Chair's prerogative to start with the first one. You talked about the Magna Carta, and of course yesterday was Democracy Day, marking 750 years since the first thing that reflected a parliament, as close as we would think of it today, took place. Obviously a style of democracy a world away from what we would see, what we would judge democracy to be today. And the Electoral Reform Society would like to think that a lot of the things you talked about today would come into effect so that people wouldn't have to wait 750 years to see today's politics as being unrecognisable, but only need to wait 20 years to look back and say, did you really used to do it that way? And I think there'll be a lot of questions about a lot of your specific proposals, but I want to ask you about politics, because I think there's a lot of agreement around the things you've discussed. But that bus stop conversation got me thinking that if well over a third, maybe up to 40% of voters vote for parties other than Labour or Conservatives and receive single-digit representation in the Commons, there'll be a sense of outrage amongst those voters. But the sad reality is that it'll be very difficult to persuade those who have voted for the two major parties that that's a problem, because although their one party didn't win, they're not too worried that these smaller parties have missed out. And I just wonder how, despite the enormous ideological differences between the Greens and UKIP, you might both have a common cause of having a lot of supporters that go unrepresented. And if you can't find a way of communicating that together, it's hard to generate that kind of anger at the bus stop where people say, we've just had an election, there's someone living in Downing Street for whom 2/3 of people did not vote. So how do we bridge the politics of that, do you think? And then once you've answered that, we'll open up for more questions.
Okay, well, I've actually for some years now had an image after the next election, and it actually probably looks more believable now than it did when I first thought of it. So that is a big march coming down Whitehall, and what you have on one side is the purple of UKIP, and on the other side you have the Green Party and Occupy together. Down the middle you have a thin line of Lib Dems. And that is the joining together. And we've got to achieve that, I think. We've got to bring lots of people together. And there are lots of people in Labour and Tory also who really do acknowledge people who've thought about this. But I think, again, the answer is how you bring on, say, if 40% voted something else and 60% vote for the two largest parties. What you've got to offer has to be really exciting. Offering going on telly and saying, right, what we want is proportional representation, and we want to use the AMS system to do the blah, 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 blah. What we need are the words, the images, the ideas that get across what it means, and that means drawing people together. And it does mean being really collegiate and really open, and that's something, I think if you go back to the AV referendum, Caroline Lucas had an amendment, which I've forgotten the numbers, but a couple of handfuls of MPs signed, that would have put PR on the referendum paper. And that there were several Tories who signed that, and a couple of Labour and people from right across the spectrum. So it is possible to draw people together on this, but I think the key is, as you do when you bring many other alliances together. And actually I'm reminded of a fascinating meeting I once went to of an organisation up in Cumbria that's against deep burial of nuclear waste up there. And it was the most fractious meeting I have possibly ever been to, because bringing together in this coalition are people who are passionately in favour of nuclear energy but don't want the deep burial, right down to green people utterly passionately involved about want to shut down the nuclear plants tomorrow. And they'd come together collectively to say, right, we're all just going to agree that all we talk about is no deep burial. And, of course, everyone in the room couldn't occasionally resist popping up and saying, well, no deep burial, but how many jobs the nuclear industry gives us? And the chair was doing a great job of squashing everyone down and saying, no, deep burial, that's what it's all about. And that's the kind of thing that you'd have to do. And it requires, a lot of self-discipline from people, a lot of passion, a lot of desire to create that one change that you can come together when you disagree on practically everything else.
Great, thank you. Well, hopefully we can give first past the post a good deep burial. Let's now move on to some questions. We'll take several questions in a round, and then you can choose the order you want to answer them in. And if you could just say your name, and given that we've heard a really solid speech, we probably don't need to hear any more speeches, so we can make them questions. And we'll try and get through as many then as we can, seeing we have a packed room. So we'll just start here, and then the gentleman in the blue, and then the man behind you, and then Keith Best behind you. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, how do we counter the crazy and increasing wealth differentials in this country, about which the government's doing nothing? And what do we do about the total absence of housing policy in London and the South East to remedy the agony of generation rent?
Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, my name is Chris Whitwell, and I'm from Friends, Families and Travellers, which is a small national charity based in Brighton that works on behalf of gypsies and travellers. And I really want to explore what you were saying about local decision making close to people's homes and power only being referred up when necessary. And you probably see where I'm going on this, because if you make power available to local communities, none of them will ever grant planning permission for a gypsy site. So the 20 to 25,000 people who actually can't exist anywhere in this country because they've got nowhere to place their homes, that issue will never be resolved. So what would you see the mechanisms by which those sorts of unpopular decisions would be made?
Great, thank you very much.
My name is John Cartledge. I was a member of the Council of ERS about 131 years. I agree with most of what you said, but I have doubts about the phrase, the nonsense of an unelected second chamber, because I would take the word unelected out of that. I can see why in a federal system you may want some institution and structure of government that represents and preserves the interests of these federal states, but that isn't what we've got in this country. There's no clamour for a second house, as far as I'm aware, in Edinburgh or Cardiff or Stormont. Indeed, Stormont got rid of its second chamber, so did Edinburgh in the 18th century. And there's no desire to go back to those. And if the function of the second chamber in this country is to correct the mistakes and shortcomings of the first chamber, surely the focus of our activity should be on remedying the deficiencies in the first chamber that are leading to the necessity for somebody else to step in and amend its errors, rather than reproducing the Oxford and Cambridge unions on a kind of grand scale at huge public expense for their very obvious public benefit.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much. Keith Best, excuse me, former Conservative MP and councillor and former chair of the Society. I want to just go back to that theme of localism, because I very much support your views about localism. But I'm one of the sad characters who, having been elected to Brighton Council in 1976, actually read the whole of the 500 pages of the Laycock report, which came out in the same year, which, as you know, was all about the relationship between central and local government. And now, of course, very much the flavour of the month because of the referendum and the whole question of the West Lothian question and matters of that nature. But the real trick, it seems to me, is that you're not going to have public confidence in any institution unless there is more transparency about the decisions it takes and the revenue and expenditure raising powers it has. And that was what Laycock was trying to address. But when we still have a situation where the predominant part of local government expenditure is funded through the block grant, through the rate support grant, how is the Green Party going to try to develop the concept of meaningful localism, where you do have subsidiarity, where you do have a local government actually taking responsibility for what it does, through actually ensuring that people know that local government is raising government money that it actually then spends on public services?
Thanks, Keith. Okay, well, four good issues there for you to
There's certainly a lot of meat in there. I'm going to start off with the first question about wealth differentials. And very, very quickly, I spend a lot of my time talking about this. You may know the Green Party wants to introduce a wealth tax on people who are worth more than £3 million of 1 or 2% a year. And what we also want to do very briefly on housing is a bit like the kind of big change that we want in terms of political systems and democracy. We want to get away from the idea that housing is primarily a financial resource and go back to houses being homes. And that's a huge and massive change on the same kind of scale as changing the whole constitution, actually. But in short, some of the measures we're looking at is we want to end right to buy, we want rent caps and security of tenure for private tenants. And we need to get away from the idea that the way you really secure your future is buy a flat in London and wait for the price to go up. But I also want to tie that actually also to the main theme of the day, which is electoral reform. And one of the big issues about wealth differentials is being able to buy your access to politics, to politicians, to the influence that contact brings. The thoughts of tennis playing Russian oligarchs flit over my mind at this point. But one of the, someone was saying to me the other day, some people in this room might recall that the Evening Standard came after me attacked me, ran a whole big political article about the fact that I caught the train to Croatia. And I should have taken a budget airline, according to the Evening Standard. And the thesis of this article was that ordinary families wouldn't do that. I don't think ordinary families actually go to green economics conferences in Croatia, actually. But someone said to me the other day, so how many ordinary families stay in Silvio Berlusconi's villa when they go on their holidays? But one of the things I didn't talk about, and it's something we desperately need, and it's one that I'm afraid I don't think we're ever going to get the public excited about, but we need to build it in, that is state funding for political parties. And that, in terms of addressing inequality of access to politics, is a really important issue that ties in with that. Chris, in terms of the whole traveller issue, I think the referring up, the key word in that is where necessary. I really believe in the principle of participatory budgeting. I've heard some exciting examples where it worked really well. But there is a problem where you're at risk, where the donkey sanctuary gets wonderfully funded and the service for autistic children kind of falls off the edge. And there has to be, and this is what we say in the Green Party and lots of things, is one of the things the centre has to do is guarantee certain basic standards. So I'll take from the example of our education policies, we don't believe in a national curriculum, but we say that the central government has to guarantee certain things that every child has a right to know. And so that's the where necessary element of, if we think of, for an example, let's say, in a current format, a really conservative local, I'm talking small c here, I'm not being party political, really conservative local council that doesn't want to do sex education in schools because, if you tell children about it, they might start thinking about it. The centre has to guarantee that every child knows how their own body works, it's got the kind of basic education about sex and relationships they need. So you do have to, it's not a case of just, okay, every community go off and do whatever you like. You've got to have some central decision making. And I think, to pick another example of that, I spent a lot of my time a few months ago defending the European Bathing Water Directive. what are the things that, no one's eating, so I can say this. What it's actually about is the level of fecal bacteria in the water. And obviously this is a Europe-wide issue, because if we dump stuff in the channel on one side, it's going to end up in other places as well, and vice versa. And so it's a case of, localism is the key word, and I always hesitate to use that these days after pickles, but you know what, we have to stick with it and hang on to it and try and recover it. But localism has to be balanced by making sure that you make decisions at the right level, and that, making sure there are sites for travellers wherever they're needed, as many as are needed. It has to be made at a more centralised level, and then you've got to work out how to do it at local level. The question about the second chamber, I have some sympathy with this, but I think I've just set out a model of huge, massive change in our politics and our constitution. What we'd have to do if we just went to one chamber is instantly go to an entirely different kind of politics. And it would require a level of cultural change that I find hard to imagine. It would require a commons where people sit round and debate the details. Lots of people who've really informed themselves and read lots of papers and the fine details of the, clause 57B4 of the legislation, rather than slinging mud at each other and making political point scoring. And I think a second chamber with a different kind of culture, you fight the political battles, and there's nothing wrong with fighting really important political battles, having hot debate. You do that in the lower chamber, and the upper chamber looks at clause 57Bs and wonders if you can phrase it better. And I think there's a different culture there. There's a different way of looking at legislation. There's a different way of looking at decisions. And I can't quite imagine how you put those two cultures together in a way that really works. So that's my personal answer to that. Meaningful localism, money, transparency. I think this is something we're actually having a lot of debate on the Association of Green Councillors list on at the moment. And of course, it comes back to the first question in that round, in terms of the question of local money-raising capacity, local tax-raising capacity. But again, and actually all of these questions tie together, because you want to allow that local transparency, but you're also going to have an awful lot of, to get equality across the country, you're also going to have a lot of subsidy from the centre, balancing from the centre, if you're not going to just allow the richer areas to get richer and the poorer areas to get poorer. So, I think we need that, but there's always going to have to be quite, until we get to a much more equal society overall, there'll have to be a lot of balancing from the centre, which is then going to some ways, mean there's less impact from the local democracy. And that's a really tricky balance. And I haven't got a perfect answer for it, but it's something we're certainly having a lot of debate about at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. I have another round of questions. There's a woman right at the back there, and then Sue, you caught my eye during the last session, and the gentleman here, Rob, and we've got another one right at the front. Okay, start with you.
Yeah, my name's Josephine. I'm from a public participation think tank called Involved. We also look at democracy issues.
Excuse me, would you mind standing up just so your voice carries a bit further to the front? Thank you.
Hi, sorry, my name's Josephine. I'm from a public participation think tank called Involved. I was just wanting to know a bit more about your thoughts or your plans on a constitutional convention, how you want to see it structured, how you want to see it communicated, whether you would imagine it would be modelled like the Irish Constitutional Convention, or whether you'd have a kind of different model for it. And also kind of related to that is whether you've been, because Labour has also come out in support of a constitutional convention, and whether you've been having conversations with them if they do end up being there ends up being kind of a left-wing coalition, if you've had conversations with them about their plans on it and where you could work together on it.
Okay, sir.
Okay, my name's Terry McGrenna, and I'm from the House Party, and I thank you for your support. Natalie, to your credit, you basically sort of dealt with the abstract and the sort of the, if you like, the theoretical idea of sort of electoral reform. But in a sense, so we're at that stage of the electoral cycle where things can get political. And it started a little earlier this time, actually. It started in December with, as usual, Polly Toynbee writing her nose peg articles. And I mean, it's not the first time that she's done this. She asked everyone to use their nose pegs in 2005 because she was worried that people were turning off the Labour Party because of the Iraq War. So now in December she's at it again. And I mean, it really predominates in her mind because she knew exactly how many days from the new year to May the 5th or whatever it is, the 7th, when the election's going to be at 127. So my point is basically that the problem is the Labour Party, and I know there are a couple of people here from people who've signed in and from other parties. So in a sense, I mean, what needs to be done is to really not so much ignore them, but basically say to them that you've had your time to put into practice a system in your manifesto for electoral reform, and you failed.
Okay.
And so basically, I mean, she's asking people to wear the nose and vote for Labour again. But the simple answer in conclusion is to ask Ed Miliband to put electoral reform in his manifesto. And if he doesn't, don't vote for Labour or any other party that doesn't do so.
Okay, we'll take that as a question about coalition negotiations and your position. To the side here.
My name's Nigel Quinton. I stood for the Lib Dems last time. I think I said pretty much everything that Natalie has said today at that time. What I was going to ask was actually the question that Josephine asked about, the Constitutional Convention and how we get that. It was in our manifesto last time. I'm pretty hopeful it will be again. But also, as she's already asked that, maybe go a bit further. I think Paul Tyler published a report last week on shaking up local democracy. It goes back to the point that Mr. Best made was, and what's your views on that? Because I mean, to me, that's the sort of fundamental reform that we need in this country, so that local democracy is much more insightful and valid for local people. It's better representation. It's got more powers, etc., etc. You can argue till the cows come home about the details, but in principle, what's your view on that proposal?
Thanks, Nigel. And at the front here, finally.
My name's Dennis Loretto. I'm a Lib Dem and I'm a long-term ERS member. I was a little puzzled about the totality of what was said and some of the ways in which some things didn't quite seem to fit in with others. The question of local democracy and particularly direct democracy, which I know you wrote back from in its full sense, but the idea that we should have a parliament that has disabled people, that has that, has this, that, and the other. Well, yeah, if they get voted for in a democracy, it was almost at times as if you were saying not improve democracy, but replace democracy. The ERS, of course, goes for proportional representation, as do I, and that would mean if you had 5-member constituencies, you would have more people, and certainly it would solve the thing of getting people like the Greens, UKIP unfortunately, etc. as well. But it would not get to the point where you'd be able to say, well, yes, there's a few disabled people here, blah, blah, blah. I do think there's some unrealism about the degree of this, and it was also interesting to hear how you rode back on the question of local democracy quite rightly when the chap made the very salient point about gypsies, and also you could say about poor areas and rich areas trying to keep all their own taxes, London particularly, ludicrous if that happened. So I just feel that I think the Greens need to sort of sit down and come up with something a bit more realistic and not just so idealistic.
A bit of free advice for you there, rather than a question. Okay, so do you want to take those, those on?
Well, first of all, just because the word coalition has been used, I'll just restate something I've been saying a great deal recently, which is we're not looking towards, should we be lucky enough to be in the situation to have any kind of choice towards coalition, but rather towards, potentially we have said we're on record very often of saying we would not prop up a Tory government if it was a Labour minority, some kind of Labour coalition minority. We'd be looking towards a vote-by-vote arrangement rather than a coalition. In deference to the Lib Dems in the room, I won't say what I usually say next.
We can take it.
We're preaching to the choir.
In terms of the the question of the structure of the Constitutional Convention. Sorry, that was in there somewhere. I've lost my notes. But I think what we really have to fight for, and possibly this is something I'd ask everyone in this room to go away and talk to your parties, your campaigns, whatever, is I think if we're going to get people excited about this, the kind of theme that I was running on, it has to be a majority of public, not people from the great and the good, the institutions, the politicians. I think in terms of the structure, there is an argument for saying, maybe a third politicians, so the political infrastructure has ownership of it, is more likely to actually implement it. But I think we need, personally, I believe we need a majority of people there who aren't representing institutions, who aren't the great and the good, but really are representative, participatory representative of the whole public. And in terms of, I've talked about, lots of people ask me about this coalition negotiation thing. We're not in that framework. I think at the moment where things are is what the outcome of this election is going to look like is so uncertain that some of you might have seen the show Newsnight I was on, where they had this wonderful speculative thing where they'd obviously had a lot of fun in possibly a slightly sixth form common room kind of way, like making up salacious headlines for the Daily Star about what happens after the election and what it looks like and who's got how many seats and graphics and everything. But I think this is just so wildly unpredictable that there's really not a lot of point in trying to do lots of maths and see what happens, because there is a real chance in this election that politics could just break wide open, and who knows what the outcomes are going to be. And I think it's better to get out there, present the policies, present the ideas, and then afterwards sit down and think, right, where do we go now? And I think we've seen a lot of, understandably, civil servants getting nervous and sort of saying, oh, but how can we live with uncertainty? We know countries in Europe that have gone months without the government, and they've got along all right. A couple of weeks, a month is not the end of the world. Exactly. So that's. I think having talks about what happens after the election in terms of the fine details, but there's really not much point at the moment. The question about local democracy and how do we make local democracy, local councils work better, I think we've got a real chicken and egg problem here, because at the moment lots of people don't want to get elected onto the local council, wouldn't even think about it, because they see things like local councillors getting up and saying, well, I know everyone in this area really hates this development, I'd love to vote against it, but the officers tell us we'll lose it on appeal and it's going to cost us £1 million, so sorry, reluctantly I've got to vote for it. So we have the real problem is we have to give local councils, local institutions more power, but until you've given them more power, the kind of people who, the range of people who might be excited get involved in them are unlikely to be attracted to the role. So I think you've kind of got to bite the bullet and just say, we start with, I suppose it's the egg, I'm not really quite sure, I guess it is the egg, change the institution and then believe that the quality of people, the different range of people will come along. And one of the things that's quite difficult about that is you have to actually pay them enough to make it possible. Particularly you see in rural areas, lots of councils that are almost entirely reasonably rich retired people, because that's the only people who can do it. And again, paying local councillors decently is not going to be a popular kind of policy, but if you want to get a range of people, you've got to do it. If it's a full-time job, it's got to be paid like a full-time job. Thank you for all of the interesting suggestions from the front. I think I do potentially believe in quotas to some degree, but I agree that you can't get a representative parliament by having quotas for this, that and everything else. But what you really need to do, I think, is look at the parliament you've got and say if that's not broadly representative of the country, then there's something wrong with the institutions and the structures. And that's why I think job share MPs is an important part of the model of thinking about this. It's not the whole solution by any means, but it's a really important part of the model. And idealistic. Well, I think we have to get away from government and politics as being managing what we've got and accepting that the way things are, the levels of inequality, the soaring rents, the state of the world, the trashing the planet, the pumping carbon at utterly unsustainable rates into the atmosphere. We don't just have to manage that, we have to change it. And that means imagining a different world.
Yeah, quite, absolutely.
Thank you, Natalie. We've got time for one more round of questions if there are some takers. We've got we've got five here. So let's see if we'll start at the very far corner there, and then the gentleman next to you, then come here, and then at the back there, and then at the front. Because there are five, let's try and keep them really short so Natalie's got a chance to reply. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Alex Gaswine. I wanted to just ask you about specific examples. That's to say, you mentioned Scotland quite a lot, and I think Scotland's a good example of a part of Britain that seems to be moving forward, particularly on constitutional matters. In parenthesis there, I would have thought you're natural allies with the SNP. I mean, you're for independent Scotland, aren't you? But other countries, which countries do you think have moved in the kind of direction that you're interested in, that you recommend as good examples, particularly on the constitutional matters?
Thank you very much. And then next to you.
Yeah, Stuart Maxwell. I've just got back from Australia. I'm probably in a minority here, but I'd just like to push you on your opposition to compulsory voting. I honestly believe that when you talk about chicken and eggs, one of the biggest chicken and eggs is you talk quite rightly about the potential for 25% elected MPs. Sorry, MPs elected on 25% share of the vote. If we carry on the way we are, then people will always be able to point to a so-called silent majority who didn't speak. If we want anger about the results of a first-past-the-post election, we force everybody to have a vote, and when they see the result of that election, then you'll get the anger to force change.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm Peter McGinty. I'm an ERS member and the proverbial floating voter, just for information. Seems to be giving their affiliations. My question is twofold, really. You've got political parties with a major set of problems about engagement for membership and supporters and all the rest of it. And you've got these, what I would call single issue, sending out the emails, the 38 Degrees, the change.org. How do you see the sort of merging of those, or is there some, something that works between them? Because you tend to get half the debate with the single issue, we want this, but let's not talk about the costs sort of thing. And the other thing, related to that partly, you mentioned direct democracy, and I agree, nobody wants to vote on everything. But there's lots of variations on that. The delegative democracy, I could delegate my vote to Natalie Bennett, for the majority of things, and on a few things that we disagree with, I could delegate it to somebody else. And all that's possible and used from various other organisations. What's your feelings about that?
Thank you very much. And at the very far corner of the room there.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name's Clem Aldwood. I'm a 70-year-old pensioner, retired. But I've been forced back to work again on 0 hours looking after geriatrics, who are much more older than I am, because nobody wants to do that job. So get everybody who's prepared to take low pay, etc., to do these jobs that nobody else wants. And I can't get any other job, so I can only get the job these other people are forced into doing. My question is with regards to local democracy. I live in Camden, and the transparency is zero. I've tried on several occasions about issues to do with contractors, hiring contractors, etc. And you cannot get, I tried the freedom of information blockage. And the usual stop reply for any inquiries like that is commercial confidentiality. And I'm sure it's not that much different among other boroughs throughout the country. So this so-called sham of democracy, I'd recommend that people read Ed Miliband's father's book on democracy in capitalist Britain, because corporate capitalism doesn't care about democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. And then finally, here at the front.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that last point. Something that was mentioned on the BBC Democracy Day yesterday is the role of the press and the media, their responsibility and their excess influence on the voting public. I don't know, I can't ask a sophisticated question, just what can we do about transparency and perhaps maybe in the BBC, just recognising the importance of the media we all wanted to go to war in Iraq, was mentioned yesterday, because the press said that would be a good idea, and then suddenly afterwards, of course, we all think completely differently. So,
okay.
Well, there's a very meaty collection there. To start off with, about the question about the SNP and the Allies, I think many people in this room may well have seen the photo of the three of us together, three women, as an alternative kind of politics. There's a lot of things we utterly disagree with the SNP on. Of course, our Scottish Green compatriots are fighting very hard against them politically. Yeah, we disagree very much on issues about fossil fuels, roads, a whole range of other issues like that. But I think one of the things I really thought sitting in that meeting with Leanne Wood and Nicola Sturgeon is this is a very tentative, very small, very minor, but possibly a start of what a proportional representation of Britain politics looks like. Because we sat there in the room and very explicitly said, what can we agree on? And you probably know we came out and said, no Trident, anti-austerity. And various other things came up, and someone said this, and someone said, no, can't do that. And so, that's fine, okay, park that, move on to something else, what can we agree on? And that is a way of, and it sort of ties into the other issue that we were talking about how do we form a coalition after this to fight for constitutional change, is that there has to be people in the room who go, right, we're not going to start a row, we're just going to park that over there if we can't go anywhere with it. And that's, I think, that's what we are doing with the SNP and with Plaid Cymru, and that's the way we're going. The compulsory voting thing, this is, I think, probably an impolite word, but there's what's known in Australia as donkey voting. And this is, if you're on the top of ballot paper, in Australia they draw the order of people on the ballot paper by lot, because being on the top of the ballot paper, depending on the constituency, is worth somewhere between about 3, 5, even 7% of the vote. Because people who've been forced to go in to the polling station, and Australia has AV, just go into the polling station and write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the ballot paper. Now, it has been suggested to me that actually these days with technology you could print the ballot papers in a random way that you could actually technically cancel that out. And yes, I'm sure that's possible, although I think I can see the technicalities getting quite technical. But anyway, it probably is possible. But I still don't think that people who, for whatever reason, just are so disengaged, I don't really see the point in forcing them into the ballot box. Okay. The delegatory voting. It sounds good in principle, can imagine it working in some cases, but I think, again, the problem is it requires a level of engagement, a level of focus on detail, a level of paying attention to stuff, that certainly in anything like the society we've got today, with a 40-hour working week, care, responsibilities and all the rest of it, where do people find the time and energy and enthusiasm to take part of that in a sensible kind of way? I just can't see in people's lives how that really fits, and going, you've still got to actually think about enough about the issues to work out what you're going to delegate and where and all the rest of it. It's not very different to actually having to vote on everything yourself. And Clem, I can only sympathise with your position, and one of
others, believe me.
Yeah, well, no, one of the things that I would find I'd have to sit on myself very hard if I was sitting in a room with you and you kept talking about constitutional reform, of not talking about immigration and how blaming immigration for low wages, when actually we should be blaming low pay on the fact that we have an inadequate minimum wage, inadequately enforced. And of course with care workers, we all know that actually care workers are paid less than the legal minimum wage because they're not paid for travelling time, which is just an absolute disgrace, and I really urge everyone in this room to campaign on this. And one of the other things that we desperately need to do a lot of work on, and please go away and do some if you can, is the whole issue of the idea of care work as unskilled work. That's how it's paid, that's how it's regarded. And yet you think about the job of, perhaps going into, the home of a slightly confused, early stage Alzheimer person who's aggressive, through no fault of their own, has multiple health issues. And you've got half an hour to sort their life out for the next 6 hours. And any idea that that can be considered unskilled is just laughable, it really is. But what you actually raised is a really important point that perhaps I should have included, and that is, you'll probably know that the Green Party is utterly opposed to outsourcing and believes the whole model of privatisation of public services is an absolute disaster. And we're doing a lot of work on, particularly on the NHS, on that score. But one of the really important issues that doesn't get debated enough is how much damage it does to democracy. And as you rightly say, the fact that the local councillor, the local MP, or the MEP gets approached by someone and they say, "Oh, can't do anything about that, it's outsourced." And one of the key areas of this, and I think the most important areas, is when we look at prisons, probation, even policing. And we need to really draw a line in the sand and say the coercive power of the state should absolutely never be outsourced, because that is really astonishingly dangerous to freedom and liberty and any kind of democratic control. And that's something that I think is really important. But it also applies on the perhaps not in the probably is a similar degree of importance to the railways or to all the other things that should be run for public benefit, not for shareholders. And a final important question, and this is something else I might have included in the main thing too, is the whole issue about the press and transparency. And when you talk about the BBC, I'm always slightly torn on this, because we are better off with the BBC than without the BBC. And I very much want to keep the BBC. And as an old newspaper editor myself, an old journalist, I can see the kind of pressure they come under, the sort of abuse they get from the right-wing media anytime they report anything, allegedly left-wing, whereas actually Monbiot this morning has got a really good point, pointing out how incredibly skewed. We've got a financial crisis, let's talk to all the people who created it and help get them to explain it. Not the people who've been criticising them for a long period of time about the fact that they could see it coming. But I think there is a really important issue, and it's really hard to get on the agenda. It's another tough one, and it bears some real resemblances to constitutional reform, which is media ownership reform. And we back the Media Reform Coalition proposals that say that basically you shouldn't be able to own more than 15% of a market, 20% with special controls. That would potentially give us at least 6 different voices just through the maths, which would help to break up the influence of the Murdochs and the rest. And I often talk about this, and I'll finish on this point, but because I think it's a great illustration. You might have heard about wind turbine syndrome. This is apparently, people who live near wind turbines have various slightly ill-defined illnesses. It only happens in English language-speaking countries. Something different about their ears or something. But actually it's a function of the fact that we have a few right-wing media tycoons, often across the world the same right-wing media tycoons, who are able to really influence reporting, the way things are covered, the way democracy is covered. And if we are going to get a genuine changed democracy, that media ownership reform is an absolutely critical issue. Thank you.
Natalie, thank you so much for your time today. We know you're a face we're going to see a lot of in the coming weeks through to May, and the fact you give us so much of your time this morning to talk about the Green Party's priority for democracy. We at Electoral Reform are very grateful to you, but not just this year. In the last over the last 3 years since you've become the leader, you've always made time for us and helping us to try and promote the issues that we think are important as well. So it's really great that you could give so much time to us. On your chairs is a copy of one of our latest reports, Tomorrow's Party. Not only do we have specific measures we'd like to see changed, but we're also trying to change political culture, so please do take away a copy of that report. We're aiming to get a report out on small C coalition government before the election to talk about the various ways in which power sharing, pluralism, cooperation can be done in a way that doesn't seem to be so scary and require a government to be formed within minutes of the ballot boxes closing on the 7th of May. And then also, of course, we're campaigning very strongly on some specific things for this election. We want to see local election reform in England and Wales to get the Scottish system, STV, being used in local elections here. The Constitutional Convention, we're leading a group of civil society organisations for a citizen-led Constitutional Convention. We've heard a lot about that today. Obviously, Lords reform, votes at 16, a registration revolution, lots of things we'd like to achieve, and we're out there campaigning for it. So we do need your support online, with your friends, talking to people and political candidates, because I think these issues are back. We can hear that from the energy in what Natalie has talked to us about as a party leader, and we want that to go far beyond just those who traditionally support us to those who can see the system's not working. So onwards and upwards we go, and please give a warm round of applause to Natalie Bennett, the leader of the